Great, so we're back talking about the discs now. Last time we talked about the spine. We looked at some of the kind of main points of the spine, the spinous processes, the transverse processes. We looked at that vertebral foramen down the center, and we talked a bit about the spinal cord itself and that communication through the spinal nerves, the innervation of the different segments, and then we looked at the facet joints as well as being a really important point of creating that mobility in the spine. And really more importantly, we talked about what's important for the spine is this balance, kind of similar to what we see in the muscular system of being able to have mobility so that we can move through our lives and articulate with the world around us, but also this really important supportive structure and protective structure of the spine to the spinal cord and those really important nerves and that communicatory system of the central nervous system with the peripheral nervous system or the rest of the body outside of the spinal cord. So next we're going to talk about the discs, another really important part of the spine to kind of understand and wrap your head around. So on Fred here, you can see the discs in between the body of the vertebra. So the body, especially in the lumbar spine, remember, is this very large, chunky portion of the vertebra because it's carrying a lot of the weight of the upper part of the body here. And the discs are positioned right in between the vertebral bodies there. The discs are really important shock absorbers for the spine. So the ability to not only absorb shock as we're moving or interrelating, maybe that's walking or running or standing. There's a lot of impact that the discs have to be able to absorb, but the discs also allow for mobility. You can imagine if you were to think of the spine here without these discs, if I just had bones stacked on top of each other, how awkward not only that would be for them to glide over each other all the time, but also that the discs create an element of space in between the bone that allow for the bones to move more easily with that space in between them. So you can imagine if for whatever reason I lost those discs, my range of motion would also be influenced, and that clearly is not going to change. I can stretch and stretch and stretch till I'm blue in the face, but if there's no space between the vertebra, the range of motion of my spine will change potentially depending on where that is and how much that is. Significantly as a result. So they're designed to help keep the back flexible, to keep the spine flexible while also resisting forces through the spine from either movement or impact from the ground beneath it. When we look at the disc, there's two main parts. So we've got an outer part, and you can see this in your manual or as you look at the page next to the spinal discs there. You'll see this is again a cross section through it. As I'm looking down on the disc, there's an outer layer and an inner layer. Notice that the outer layer looks a lot like tree rings, and that annulus fibrosus, which is the outer layer, is simply this layer of alternating kind of directionality of this fibrous tissue to create a really strong outer membrane to contain the inner portion of the disc, which is a little bit more often compared to like the jelly filling. So this outer portion, the annulus fibrosus, is made of strong fibrous tissue, and what makes this tissue really strong is that the directionality of the orientation of that fibrous tissue is changing. It's alternating within those rings that you see in the manual, that's alternating its directionality to create strength in that outer layer, which is really important. You can imagine, I'm sure you've had someone or heard of someone have herniations or have an issue with their disc. When we aren't able to contain that inner part of the nucleus of the disc, when that strength of the fibrous outer portion is compromised for whatever reason, that can happen for many different reasons, the nucleus starts to leak out. And you can imagine there's a lot of implications there, both to the disc height as well as to pain, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this outer membrane, this annulus fibrosus, has to have this strong tension or tensile component to it to be able to contain the inner part. So the inner part, the nucleus pulposus, is this jelly filling. It's often compared to a jelly donut, though I don't know it's really an accurate comparison because hopefully the annulus fibrosus is a lot tougher than the outer segment of a jelly donut. But we have this inner filling. And that filling, you can imagine that the filling inside of the disc is really what helps to create this mobility. It allows for this movement between, to have that squishy component in the center that allows for the mobility between the vertebra, for them to move over top of each other, to have that nucleus in between. Now, the tricky part to this is that that nucleus purposus also contains proteins. And the annulus fibrosus around it, the outer layer at least, contains nerves. And if I get some of the nucleus that starts to leak out of it, it can be really irritating. The proteins, when they come in contact with the nerves, can be really irritating. And that's oftentimes the pain that people experience with a herniated disc, as well as the tissues around it, which are affected as well. So we've got the nerves and the annulus fibrosis and the outer layers of the annulus fibrosis. We've got the proteins and that squishy component of the nucleus inside of it that allow for, again, this balance. We see this over and over and over, this yin and yang balance between stability and containment of the annulus fibrosis and that mobility, that flexibility of that inner gel-like filling of the nucleus that allows for us to be able to move more freely there. The other thing that becomes tricky here is that there, again, is no direct blood supply to the discs. So the discs depend on the blood supply of the surrounding tissues. They also depend on movement to help create what we call this mechanism of imbibing, which is literally these changes in pressure that draw fluid into the disc, that create the suppleness, this plumpness that's really so important for the health of the spine and our mobility within the spine. So even small little movements are really important for that ability to create this imbibing mechanism, to simply change the pressure around the disc to draw fluids in, and this is in a small amount, to allow us to keep that plumpness of the disc in between. So simple movements, really gentle movements, can be really helpful for that. It doesn't need to be anything fancy or deep. In fact, I find myself that really simple movements, gentle movements, can be really helpful for creating that in particular. When we look at the discs, one thing that's really important to consider when we talk about the discs is these weight-bearing points of the spine. So if you were to, again, imagine that you took a cross-section through the spine, what you would see is that we have 3 weight-bearing points between the vertebra. So we've got one vertebra stacking on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, and there's 3 main points, 3 points where those bones are going to touch. One is very clear, right? We've got the body of the vertebra and the discs that are articulating, that are really kind of our main weight-bearing point. The other we talked about already are the 2 facet joints. So we've got one on each side that's going to articulate with the vertebra above, and one underneath that's going to connect to the vertebra below. So our 3 weight-bearing points are going to be 1 facet on each side and a body in the front, the body of the vertebra in front. Now, why this is helpful to understand is because if you can imagine here on Fred, and I'll turn him to the side so you can see a little bit better. Move his arm out of the way there. It's a fancy move there. But if you can imagine from the side view, again, here's the weight-bearing point of the body of the vertebra, and then we've got the facet joints above and below the vertebra here in the back. So as I come into flexion, this weight is being put more into the disc and the body of the vertebra, versus as I come into extension, the weight is being put more into the facet joints. And again, I'm kind of just laying some of the foundations and framework for a lot of your deeper learning at some point. If you continue along this anatomy path, I think there's so many fascinating things to learn. But one simple thing we could take away from that is this clear awareness that if someone has disc pain, they're probably going to feel it a lot more as they start to fold forward, and potentially, usually in most scenarios, have no pain as they start to bend backwards. So we can kind of apply some of these in many different ways, and I'll just leave those as little tidbits, little hints for you to chew on. But as we look at this simple understanding of the spine, of these 3 weight-bearing points, we see that the weight is going to be put more into the discs, which is also the body of the vertebra as I bend forward, and more into the facet joints as I bend backward. So if there was some irritating circumstance happening at the facet joints for whatever reason, clearly I might feel more discomfort as I'm bending backwards. So the next thing we want to consider now is the movement of the spine. Now, this can be complicated and it can also be very simple. When we look at this, the movements of the spine are really determined primarily by the shape of the bones here. And what we see is that both the spinous processes are going to change, as well as the shape of the vertebra and the facet joints, which we won't really see too much until we really look really closely, but we also see that the connections change. So up here in the cervical vertebra, we don't have any connections here. We've got this free-floating cervical spine. The spinous processes stick more outright, so I actually get a lot of range of motion in all directions. The cervical spine gets a lot of flexion and extension, gets a lot of rotation, gets a lot of lateral flexion. So our primary movements of the spine are going to be extension and flexion. We'll talk about these later. Rotation and lateral flexion. And in the cervical spine, I do all of those pretty well. And you probably noticed that. It's a good thing because our eyes are in the front of our head. It allows me to do all these things, be able to look around and orient myself in relationship to my surroundings. So really important here. I'm also not carrying a lot of weight around yet, so I can move around pretty safely there because I'm not carrying all of this around. Now, as I get down a little bit further, what I see now is that not only are the spinous processes changing their angle, you can see that they're pointing pretty sharply downward here, but I also now have the rib cage that's connecting to the vertebra here. So each rib is connecting to one vertebral level here. So this is important. Clearly, my primary function is to stay alive, right? I'll always choose life over mobility. Personally, I think you would probably too. And this is really important because the rib cage protects these really essential organs of the heart and the lungs, things that we really need to keep well protected. So the ribs are there for a purpose. Unfortunately, there's pros and cons to everything. With the attachment of the ribs, we also lose a lot of mobility in the thoracic spine. So not only the spinous processes pointing down will clearly limit this extension. Right? At some point, the bones are going to hit each other, so I'm not going to be able to extend a lot in the thoracic spine. But now I also have my rib cage on the front, so my ability to really flex, at least the thoracic spine, is going to be somewhat limited as well. Now, most of us don't notice that because we think of our spine as a unit. We flex and extend the whole thing, maybe some parts more than others here. But if we look at the thoracic spine, if we could really separate it, the thoracic spine does very little flexion and extension. And again, there's a purpose to this, clearly to allow for that protection of these vital organs of the heart and the lungs. The lumbar spine gets a lot of flexion and extension. So again, we go from being in an area with a lot of mobility to a lot less mobility to, again, another free-floating area here. There's no connections until I get to the pelvis and the rib cage. Another free-floating area where we get a lot of mobility. So we get a lot of flexion and extension happening naturally in the lumbar spine, which is why we pay so much attention to it in yoga, because our tendency is, as a result, to lay in the lumbar spine. Maybe in our yoga poses, maybe just posturally. This might be kind of how we sit. But that there becomes these challenges that happen in different segments of the spine towards too much mobility or towards a lack of mobility or too much mobility up here as well. So what we see here is we get the most range of motion in the cervical spine. We get more after the cervical spine, and that's kind of all over the board. After the cervical spine, we get the most flexion and extension in the lumbar spine. And then we get more rotation in the thoracic spine. So the thoracic spine is really what allows us to rotate really efficiently. The lateral flexion, the last of those movements we talked about, is going to be done somewhat continuously through the spine. Cervical, thoracic, and lumbar are going to be working together to create this lateral flexion that happens more continuously. We can think of that C shape that we think about in yoga. We often talk about having this perfect C shape. Right, is actually probably happening more naturally as we side bend than as we back bend here, because our tendency is very little to bend in the thoracic spine, and you'd really have to remove quite a few ribs to change that. We also see at the very top of the skull, the first two joints of the cervical spine are a little bit different than the others. The vertebrae are shaped a little bit differently. And for our purposes, it's just helpful to know that a lot of the mobility that's happening in the cervical spine is happening at those first two joints. Because they have a lot more mobility, because they're shaped differently, we see the occiput, or the base of the skull here, connecting with C1, which is also called the atlas sometimes. Those two are going to create this yes motion. And between C1 and C2, the axis, we see this no motion. So we see a lot of this movement of the head really happening at those first two joints. And then, again, the cervical spine in general, compared to the rest of the spine, is still pretty mobile. So, cervical, lots of mobility. Thoracic, we do really good at rotation. Lumbar, we do really good at flexion and extension. And then lateral flexion is going to happen somewhat throughout the whole system.